Hello everyone, welcome back for part 3 of the gridded portrait. In this we're going to be focusing on creating outlines around the value changes that we see within the image. This is another way of course, flattening the shapes that we see or the images that we see within our picture, but this will help us be able to fill in those areas of value and then go over those areas later on with either pulling up with the eraser, going back over and making our darks very dark. So take a look. It's sped up slightly just to help this move over a little bit quicker. Feel free to revisit certain areas as you see fit.
Hi everybody, so we are back for round number 3. We have now completed the outline and contour lines of our drawing, of our picture for our drawing or in our drawing. And so now what's going to happen is we are going to start to further define some of the lights and the darks that we see within this image. And so what that oftentimes requires is that you try to identify areas of really bright and really dark areas. So here's a really nice dark shape that we can kind of work from. So you see how I'm kind of outlining this shape, right, with my pencil, and this shape with my pencil. That is a way that we are going to capture the value changes, the value variations in this composition. So there's a couple ways to do this. So there's this way where you're literally looking at and thinking about this as a face. And then there's the other way of doing this where you turn this upside down and what you have is the general idea of the shape, right? So rather than seeing this as you're still knowing it's a face, but now maybe you're seeing it because it's upside down. It's maybe this kind of curvilinear, triangular, or crescent shape, really. It's kind of a crescent shape. So that's kind of what we want to do as we're doing this. Either you can work upside down, which is helpful for a lot of people, or you can work upside right and still get the similar results. So I've already kind of started in some sections outlining things like hair and where the eyebrows get darker, and the lower part of the nose here. See, there's that shape that's referencing the shape of the shadow under my nose. So yeah, so I'm going to just start on a couple of these, on a few of these, the larger shapes maybe, and then we can start to hone in on some of the smaller shapes. And with the smaller shapes, and in particular the lighter shapes, you want to continue to work very lightly. I might be drawing a little bit darker for the sake of the demonstration, but the lighter you work with this process, the much easier it is to work into the value ranges and the subtleties between lights and darks within those value ranges. So what you'll need is a pencil. You're now done with the ruler, unless you need to redraw lines, and maybe an eraser will be helpful. And one thing that I like to do is get an X-Acto knife and cut a small piece of the eraser to make it a little bit sharper. It would be the equivalent of having a smaller version of this eraser with sharper edges. So that's extremely helpful when you're working into smaller areas of detail. So that's primarily what you need. But let's put the erasers aside for a little while, and let's just focus purely on identifying the shapes and values that we see. So I'm going to pull my camera a little bit closer so we can see. I like to start with the larger shapes first. So essentially what's going to happen is it's going to look like paint by numbers. So I'm seeing a value here, and it's still helpful to have your grid. There's another value here, and another value down here. So I'm following along with this arm, or this shape of an arm. And the more angular you can keep your lines, the better. I'm seeing a small change in value right around this part here. And the thing about it is, the more you're able to see those nuances. In this case, there's chiaroscuro, but it's not as exaggerated as the chiaroscuro that we see in a lot of Renaissance paintings and Renaissance still life paintings. But there's this idea that light is bouncing off of everything. It's there, and as a result of that, when the light is hitting the object, in this case the subject, which is myself, there are things reflecting back. So the light is coming down at this kind of diagonal here. The overall main light source is kind of coming. It's a really bright day. And what's happening is there's a lot of bounce back. So there's this wonderful light blue area here that is bouncing back into that edge. It's creating a nice little light edge. But here it's a dark edge right along that area. So I'm trying to notice when there are little changes like that happening, so that way I can really embrace the lights and the nuances, lights and darks which are value, and nuances within this form. I'm even seeing highlight here, right about here. So again, this is where I'm also able to still use the grid to help me draw. Again, this is a really light area on my arm, so I don't want to draw it too dark. There's a dark area along the top of my arm, so it represents where that sunlight isn't able to directly hit as much. And the more angular you can keep this, the easier it is later on when it comes to filling in the values. I like to use a single directional hatch mark, which I'll go into on a later demo. So I'm seeing all kinds of wonderful things happening with this image. So here I drew out this lighter shape. I drew out another light shape. So if you are familiar with anatomy, in this case, because we're working with a figure, there's some wonderful things that happens with the figures. And this is why I really enjoy teaching my figure drawing class. It's primarily because the skeletal system is basically a structure to hold up the skin and the muscle, which are similar in many ways to cloth. The cloth needs to drape onto a structure in order to defy gravity. So the skeletal system is very helpful at that. And so thinking about this idea of those two bones being in the arm, we are able to identify 1, 2, right? So that's why I have these two lines to represent those changes in that value. Now there are overall changes that are happening as well with this, where it's somewhat light for the most part in this area, summing it up in summary, light here, but it's probably the brightest in this area here. And this is where it will be very helpful to maybe print out 2 or 3 different versions of your image. And if you can alter the value, really pushing the contrast, really pushing the highlights, like, on the Instagram apps, how you can edit those. It's similar in that way where you're able to push the lights and darks in the image, and that will help us see those shapes a lot better. And so due to my ability to kind of see these shapes, and I'm sitting very closely to this, I'm able to see those nuances. But let's go to some more clearly evident shapes. So let's say the shape here that's under the arm. I'm going to do a little bit of correcting. And so this is where value can play another role in helping us further define our object. I'm going to pull that in just a little bit. And again, drawing, and also having a clean eraser is helpful. This eraser is a little bit dirty. What I like to do when it gets like this, I just go off to the side and I clean my eraser. That can make or break some areas of contrast and value here. So I'm really paying attention to those changes, right? So this is not a perfectly straight line, right? This is not a perfectly straight line. So I'm doing my best to notice those changes. And, it's close. It's great if you have something that's close to being correct. With drawing, this is philosophical, so everybody is different. This is my own personal philosophy with drawing. Even though we're working from a photograph, I believe it's important to maintain some degree of the artist's hands in the work, in the drawing. And that can play out in a lot of different ways. That can play out with how the image is shaded. That can play out with how the image is rendered. So if certain areas are exaggerated or made smaller, diminished. And also, lines don't necessarily occur in nature. So leaving a line is another great way of saying, hey, this is a drawing. But value for the most part is very much about the absence of line. So I'm seeing the folds here in this costume, and I am allowing myself to really pay attention to those value changes. So yeah, going back to that idea that it doesn't have to be perfect to get your point across, to be an effective drawing. But you do want some degree if you're doing representational work, because it's really about embracing the fact that this is a drawing, that it is made by an artist's hands, and there's going to be some degree of how that figure is interpreted. It's still prevalent in this piece. And that adds to the uniqueness of what you're doing. So here I'm just indicating that it goes dark, a little light here. So I am also indicating that there's a little bit of darkness where the arm is overlapping the actual image. So now I'm also indicating that there are folds here. So for the most part, this is a pretty flat costume as far as its tonality and value and texture, suggested texture in this case that we'll be rendering in our composition. But if it were a little bit more textured, you would really want to be able to take your time to see the shapes as they are. The lights and darks as they are as shapes. So there are a lot more nuances that I can see. Maybe this is a larger shape here. There's a nice little sharp area of blue, again, reflecting. This is why blue backgrounds are so interesting. There's a little, so this is a great opportunity to talk about a mark of demarcation or a line of demarcation. So I mentioned earlier about there not being lines in nature. When you're walking down the street, you don't see lines outlining trees or birds or houses for that matter. Really what we see is how shapes are kind of contrasting each other, or more so values are contrasting each other. And so when two values contrast each other, what you have is an edge. And the way we interpret that edge is by possibly drawing, like looking at the shadow, dark, shadow, light background. And so what's created is the concept of a line. Like lines are really conceptual. And so what you have is this nice kind of, you could draw an outline to indicate that shadow that you see there. So that's using black line. One thing that isn't always embraced, or that takes some time to embrace, is the idea of the white line, right? There's this outline here on the arm that is a really fine line, but it's saying a lot. It's telling us that this light is bouncing back off of this wall onto this arm. Same thing is happening here, right? So thinking about underneath, there's muscle, there's fat, there's bone, right? Underneath all of this, underneath this skin, underneath this covering. And so what happens is that skin can also reflect, that muscle can also create a form on the skin or underneath the skin that creates these really nice shapes. So that's something to think about when you're doing this, is saying, oh, is that white line or is that black line? Is that shadow? So again, I'm drawing light, so it's easier to just erase and pick up where I left off. So what's happening here, and if you think about the body being made of shapes or geometric forms, this is almost a cylindrical form, right? So I'm going to draw it on the back of it, what that means, right? So I've got this arm, and it's doing some really wonderful things, so maybe closer to a cone. And as a result of it, you have this darker tone, as we saw earlier, so just summing up that shape. And you've got another tone here, right? That's creating another value, and then, of course, you had those other shapes going on there. So if you think about it, this is really a cylindrical form. You can follow that idea when you're actually doing the value on this. You're able to see it a little bit better, almost somewhat predict it, right? Predict it a little bit better, because you understand that this form, it just makes sense. That is what reads into this being a convincing drawing. The idea that there's consistency in how we're rendering shapes of value. So I'm just going to document as many of these as I can. Now, I was starting to make one up there. There's a highlight right here. And as you see, what's happening is you've got this outline that's representing, say even the outline of the body against the form of the cloth or the concept of the clothing. But what's happening here is within that outline, you have these wonderful contour lines that's helping us identify the form, right? So you have the lower half of the hand and the upper half of the hand. And the value is really what is indicating that for us. Those value changes are really what's indicating that for us. So I'm just going to move around a little bit so you can kind of see all of the different ways that we can address this. And this is where the likeness really starts to form, right? So I remember teaching this a couple times, and people would say, well, it doesn't look like me. Well, there's a few reasons why. So when you think about the likeness, there's a lot of factors that play into making someone, or something in this case, look like someone or something else. It's primarily the ability to be able to build up with several mechanisms of drawing to be able to do that. So you could do it with a very quick gestural line drawing, which would be excellent to do. And it takes a lot of fun practice to do it, but it's very much worth it. You could do that. Or in this case, as we're doing for the value study, for this value portion of the assignment, you could also render the value, right? You could render the form, the suggested form, using value ranges. So with that, you have, within the face, you got all these wonderful changes. You got all these wonderful nuances. And so it's easy for the mind to not be able to make those connections immediately. But through more time, and that's something that I also encourage anyone who's drawing, is to just be patient and give yourself time to allow for the image to form. Through time, it begins to develop into you. I am going to, so there's some corrections that I'm making even as I'm drawing right now. I'm really trying to get my cheekbone down. Like, that is everything for me. So I've got the values of the hair is great. I love hair because, again, it's like a cloth form, and it does these wonderful things, and it goes from light to dark, and it has all these wonderful nuances. So, do your best to capture all of those little shifts and changes. So even within there's the darkness, right? So in the darkness here, we have darker values, right? We have a really nice dark value right before we go back to the dark area again for the remainder of the hair. So the more that you do this, the more you're able to see those nuances. What really makes hair feel like hair is when you're able to capture as much of those changes in the tonalities of the hair as possible. You could start out with one large form, but it would help for you to zoom in and add those smaller shapes as we go. So what would that look like, if I had a cute little bob like that working, essentially thinking about what we just looked at, right? So we've got that overall darkness and shape there, but then there's probably other little things happening, right? So the more of those that you can capture, the more dimension the hair will have in this composition. So at first, this didn't read the same way, right? Like we didn't necessarily see as much. Let's see if I can turn this up a little bit. So we didn't see as much of the values as we see now. And the likeness is definitely starting to form even now, right? I'm seeing these changes in my chin as well, which is really going to help pull out some of those other features in my face. So again, we have that highlight in my ear. And sometimes I really like to go and save these smaller details, like these more involved details, for later, because I realize in some cases it's okay to have a few areas that are vague. And it's another way to create focal point, right? Like the focal point in this case is maybe the upper bust of this image, which is the head to the lower rib. And so with that, you have all of these other little intricacies that may or may not be that important depending on how much you want the viewer to focus on those aspects. So with the braid, I'm going and I'm drawing each of those little highlights that I see there in the hair. So I'm seeing that there's a curl there. There's something going on with the nose. And again, you really want to outline as much of this, even with your grid, as light as possible. And so this dark line, even for my grid, is going to come back and get me, primarily because it is a little too dark. But I am an artist. I've been drawing for a while. A lot of being an artist is problem solving. So at some point, I'm going to address that. But for right now, I'm just going to document as much of the values that I can and highlights that I can, highlights, midtones, and shadows. I mean, this is where, I think being able to communicate and talk about value ranges in regards to how we utilize Instagram to have filters on our images. I think that's just these are such great tools to be able to add to the learning process, learning how to do photography. And, it's really just allowing for a great stepping stone for us to get into the meat of why we're doing what we're doing as creatives. All right, so I'm going to also render this shadow. I feel like that is going to be what helps to ground the image. Again, I'm not going for perfection. It's okay because it's a shadow as well. A matter of fact, I think it's even more interesting if the shadow is a little wonky. Again, I am doing this intentionally, though. I am looking for, if we are making those decisions, I'm looking for this to be an intentional decision. So that's a great way to ground the figure. So thinking about the lower half of this costume, it's getting a little bit dark. This is where I might use a little bit more kind of freedom. All right. So this was more of the the value ranges. I'm missing some of the highlights on my face. Like, oh, having this highlight here. I remember taking a makeup class, and one of the fun parts was putting on the foundation and the concealer, and it was also cool because we could start when we got to the part where we're doing like the foundation, or I guess it's the foundation. At some point, it's like painting. At some point, though, you end up doing highlights, and I remember one highlight could be on the nose. Sometimes you need to do it, and sometimes you don't need to do that, from what I've been learning. So this might make me look a little bit older, because more lines on the face tend to do that. Not anything wrong with age, of course, but in regards to making it look like you, right? The less lines in a drawing you have, the better. The more it will start to feel like you. And again, that's the idea that value doesn't have a lot of line on it. But yeah, so I think this is the thing. This is the moment that everybody's kind of looking at, and so in understanding that this is, again, just the beginning stages, but there's just so many value ranges even within this that we could capture how it gets a little bit darker there underneath the, let's see if there's a way we could keep a little bit. I don't think there's a way I could do that. I have to zoom back out again. Okay. So who is this character? I got a couple questions about who is this character. This is Chun-Li for people that aren't aware of certain video game characters, and I was her for Halloween. I think cosplay might just be my thing. As a performance artist, one of the opportunities that I enjoyed the most is, correct myself, humbling. Drawing can be very humbling. So that was not happening in that quadrant. That was happening here. So I need to take that up. Right. Good thing we caught that, right? And I'm okay with correcting myself. So now that feels a little bit better. I was like, why does that feel a little strange? And I am also going to pull this in a little bit. And cosplay is a really great opportunity to be someone else for a couple days. And you can do it not during Halloween as well. So it's a year-round expression, year-round opportunity for self-expression. Chun-Li is one of the first female video game characters. It's fighting characters in particular that was in the history of all gaming. So I was her, and there's always a spin to my costumes. I like to know about who I'm dressing as a little bit. All right, so there we have it. Let's go in a little bit more to see all the little value changes and ranges and nuances. So it's close. It's really close. I'm seeing some things I could push and pull a little bit, and there's even a slight little change here that represents the darker area under where the lips meet. It's a highlight on the hand here that I need to get. So yeah, the more time you spend on this portion, the more you can spend actually capturing the nuances within your photograph and really pushing the lights and darks to an area where you have a pretty good sense of form happening on this two-dimensional surface, or aka on the drawing. And stay tuned for the next section, which will be about filling in the values. Get your pencils, erasers, and maybe even Q-tips ready. Ciao.